Well, it's a privilege to be here again. I'm really impressed with what Scott and the other leaders of FAIR have been able to do. For example, to get the previous speaker here, I'm astonished at their influence with the parole board. Brian told a joke that reminded me of another joke, and probably you've heard this one, about the dyslexic, insomniac atheist who stays awake all night wondering if there's a dog. It takes a while, doesn't it? I'd like to welcome Claudia Bushman to the ranks of the apologists. Brian raised the question of whether or not apologists ever make mistakes. I would have disagreed with him until about a week ago when I made my first. I mistakenly used the obsolete term brontosaurus instead of apatosaurus and was promptly jumped on for it. But I can take it. Now, I lead off with some jokes because this is going to be an incredibly boring presentation. There are no jokes in it, no insults. But the question you have to ask yourself as you listen is there an acrostic? So listen very, very carefully. I'd like to thank Mike Ash for helping me out with the PowerPoint. I wasn't planning to have any, but it was decided that I needed it, which is probably true, and so I'm able to look technically or technologically literate with his help just today. I'm going to read this paper, which I normally don't do, and I apologize for that. I was intimidated by the performance earlier today, so I set about at first to memorize it, and then I thought that I would try to go one better by reciting it to you backwards, but I think I'll just do it in the Orthodox fashion. There's just a lot of stuff here, and I want to make sure I didn't leave it out. I feel very strongly about the topic I'm going to be talking about, so please bear with me. I'll try to make it lively. My wife said, "Keep me awake," which may suggest an impossible standard, but I will try. Joseph Smith's claims regarding the Book of Mormon seem, at least on the surface, to be very detailed and utterly tangible. They're not mystical claims, but belong to the real world of everyday physical objects. And critics have not been reluctant to meet them head on. As for the golden plates, wrote the evangelical Protestant polemicist G.H. Fraser, we will say simply, there were not any. The gold plates, declared a critic on the FAIR message board just yesterday, never existed outside Joseph's fertile mind. But the historical evidence suggests, no, it shouts the contrary. A representative statement is that given during an 1878 interview with Orson Pratt and Joseph F. Smith by David Whitmer, which is not here on the screen. It was in June 1829, the latter part of the month. Martin Harris was not with us at this time. He obtained a view of the plates afterwards, the same day. Joseph, Oliver, and myself were together when I saw them. We not only saw the plates of the Book of Mormon, but also the brass plates, the plates of the Book of Ether, the plates containing the record of the wickedness and secret combinations of the people of the world, down to the time of their being engraved, and many other plates. The fact is, it was just as though Joseph, Oliver, and I were sitting just here on a log when we were overshadowed by a light. It was not like the light of the sun nor like that of a fire, but more glorious and beautiful. It extended away around us, I cannot tell how far, but in the midst of this light, about as far off as he sits, pointing to John Whitmer, sitting a few feet from him, there appeared, as it were, a table with many records or plates upon it, besides the plates of the Book of Mormon, also the sword of Laban, the directors, and the interpreters. Lucy Mack Smith, who had seen the chosen witnesses leave for their encounter with the angel in the plates, recalled many years later the scene that ensued at their return. When they returned to the house, it was between 3 and 4 o'clock p.m. Mrs. Whitmer, Mr. Smith, and myself were sitting in a bedroom at the time. On coming in, Joseph threw himself down beside me and exclaimed, "Father, Mother, you do not know how happy I am. The Lord has now caused the plates to be shown to 3 more besides myself. They've seen an angel who has testified to them, and they will have to bear witness to the truth of what I have said, for now they know for themselves that I do not go about to deceive the people. And I feel as if I was relieved of a burden which was almost too heavy for me to bear. And it rejoices my soul that I am not any longer to be entirely alone in the world." Upon this, Martin Harris came in. He seemed almost overcome with joy and testified boldly to what he had both seen and heard. And so did David and Oliver, adding that no tongue could express the joy of their hearts and the greatness of the things which they had both seen and heard. Ultimately, each of the three witnesses, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer, signed his name to a statement that has appeared in every edition of the Book of Mormon from the beginning. According to David Whitmer, the quite distinct experience of the 8 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, the 8 as opposed to the 3, occurred 1 or 2 days after the experience of the 3. Soon thereafter, all of the 8 signed their names to a statement that has accompanied the testimony of the 3 in every printed version of the Book of Mormon. It's worth examining the contrasting character of the experiences reported by the 3 witnesses and the 8, since I believe their very difference reinforces them. First of all, the experience of the 3, as they report it, was suffused with the glory and power of God. In a brilliant light, an angel came down and showed them the plates. They heard the voice of God, testifying that the translation had been accomplished by the gift and power of God. Their written testimony is characterized by a marked religious or spiritual tone. It might be termed a supernatural or miraculous testimony. By contrast, the experience of the 8 involves no glory, nothing miraculous. It's as mundane as anything can be. No angel shows the plates to them. Joseph Smith does. There's no miraculous light. Unlike the 3, who seem simply to have observed the plates in the hands of the angel, the 8 handled the plates and turned their pages. They hefted them. The language of their official account is cool and even formal or legalistic, to the point of emotional distance, the said Smith. God appears in their testimony only as witness to their concluding oath. His voice does not testify to the correctness of the translation. The 8 witnesses are manifestly in full possession of their senses and mental faculties. Theirs might be labeled an ordinary or natural testimony. Why the differences? In order, I think, for the task of skeptics to be rendered more difficult. One might be tempted to dismiss the testimony of the 3 with its spectacular divine accompaniments as hallucinatory, however untenable that dismissal would be, or mere superstition. By contrast, there is absolutely nothing in the testimony of the 8 that points to superstition or hallucination. It is the most matter-of-fact kind of experience, 9 men in the woods in the early afternoon, except for the object at the center of it. On the other hand, if one were to approach the witnesses first by way of the 8, and one were inclined to skepticism, one might be tempted to write their experience off as deception by Joseph Smith, or by some other conspirator or group of conspirators. There must really have been plates fabricated to deceive. But this doesn't account for the testimony of the 3, which goes beyond fabrication and involves a number of additional objects. In other words, a single explanation seems unable to account for the 2 very different kinds of experience. This means that the skeptics who wish to explain the 2 testimonies away must resort to some unlikely combination of sincere hallucination, already unlikely in and of itself, and deliberate insincere fabrication. Or, as we shall see, they must attempt to collapse the difference between the 2. Let's examine a case that critics often cite as a parallel to Joseph Smith and his witnesses. Forgery is the virtually certain explanation for the 2 sets of inscribed metal plates that James Jesse Strang said he had found in Wisconsin and Michigan between 1845 and 1849 and translated. Strang, who claimed to have a letter of appointment from Joseph Smith, announced himself as Joseph Smith's successor and was clearly seeking to imitate the prophet. That his plates really existed is beyond serious dispute. The first set, the 3 Vori or Rajamanchu plates, were dug up by 4 witnesses whom Strang had brought into the appropriate site. Inscribed on both sides with illustrations and writing, the Rajamanchu plates were roughly 1.5 by 2.75 inches in size, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand or to carry in a pocket. Among the many who saw them was Stephen Post, who reported that they were brass, and indeed that they resembled the French brass used in familiar kitchen kettles. With all the faith and confidence that I could exercise, he wrote, all that I could realize was that Strang made the plates himself, or at least that it was possible that he made them. One not altogether reliable source reports that most of the 4 witnesses to the Rajamanchu plates ultimately repudiated their testimonies. The 18 plates of Laban, likewise of brass, and each about 7 3/8 by 9 inches, were first mentioned in 1849, and in 1851 were seen by 7 witnesses. Their testimony appeared at the front of the Book of the Law of the Lord, which Strang said he had translated from the plates of Laban. Work on the translation seems to have begun at least as early as April 1849. An 84-page version appeared in 1851. By 1856, it had reached 350 pages. The statement of Strang's witnesses speaks of seeing the plates. but mentions nothing of any miraculous character. Nor did Strang supply any second set of corroborating testimony, comparable to that of the three witnesses to the Book of Mormon. One of the witnesses to the plates of Laban, Samuel Bacon, eventually denied the inspiration of Strang's movement and denounced it as, quote, mere human invention, end quote. Another, Samuel Graham, later claimed that he had assisted Strang in the fabrication of the plates of Laban. The well-read Strang had been an editor and lawyer before his brief affiliation with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and his subsequent career as a schismatic leader. Thus, Strang's plates were much less numerous than those associated with Joseph Smith. His witnesses saw nothing supernatural. His translation required the better part of a decade, rather than a little more than 2 months, was done by a man with much education, unlike Joseph Smith, and unlike the witnesses to the Book of Mormon, Strang's witnesses did not remain faithful to their testimonies. Milo Quaife, in his early standard biography of Strang, reflected that it's quite conceivable that Strang's angelic visitations may have had only a subjective existence in the brain of the man who reported them, but the metallic plates possessed a very material objective reality. If we're unwilling to accept the Book of the Law of the Lord is authentically divine, he says, we can hardly escape the conclusion that Strang knowingly fabricated and planted them for the purpose of duping his credulous followers, and accordingly that Strang's prophetic career was a false and impudent imposture. Well, I'll skip a little bit more on that. It seems that virtually every reputable writer on the subject now grants the sincerity and honesty of all or most of the Book of Mormon witnesses. And this reminds me, by the way, of J.B. Haldane's theory, or his schema of how scientific theories that are once rejected come to be accepted. Stage 1, the new theory is denounced as false and complete nonsense. Stage 2, it's described as perverse but an interesting thought. Stage 3, it's true but unimportant. Stage 4, I've always said that. I think we may be at stage 3 with regard to the witnesses. It's true that they're sincere, but that doesn't matter. A few critics argue that the printed testimonies don't really represent what the witnesses said. I want non-LDS to know, wrote one recent poster on an internet message board, that regardless of the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon and the 8 witnesses of the Book of Mormon, not a single witness ever touched the plates with their own hands and never saw the plates with their own eyes. When Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery supposedly had visions of the Book of Mormon for their testimony, only Joseph Smith wrote their testimony down in the Book of Mormon. But the witness testimonies appear in the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting. They're copies of the original ones, which were probably kept with the original manuscript, but are no longer extant. Significantly, when Orson Pratt and Joseph F. Smith visited David Whitmer near the end of his life and were shown the printer's manuscript, Whitmer claimed that this was the original. But Joseph F. asked Whitmer why, then, Whitmer's signature was written in the same hand as everything else. Whitmer had no ready answer. But Whitmer clearly remembered that he had individually signed the statement of the 3 witnesses, thus personally witnessing that he agreed with what was written there. These testimonies have been published with the Book of Mormon ever since the first edition in 1830, which, since it was prepared under the careful supervision of Oliver Cowdery, one of the 3, and Hiram Smith, one of the 8, seems to imply their endorsement of those statements. The other witnesses, too, had plenty of time to distance themselves from those printed testimonies, but instead consistently affirmed them. For instance, a correspondent for the Salem, Massachusetts Advertiser and Argus reported in 1843, having heard Hiram, quote, declare in this city in public that what is recorded about the plates and so on and so forth is God's solemn truth, end quote. E.C. Brand visited John Whitmer, one of the 8, in 1875, and recorded that Whitmer declared that his testimony as found in the testimony of 8 witnesses in the Book of Mormon is strictly true. In 1876, Whitmer told Mark Forscott, I have never heard that any one of the 3 or 8 witnesses ever denied the testimony that they have borne to the book as published in the first edition of the Book of Mormon. And later that same year, referring to the published testimony, he told Heman Smith, that testimony was, is, and will be true, henceforth and forever. Finally, in 1877, the year prior to his death, he wrote, concerning my testimony as recorded in the Book of Mormon, that it is the same as it was from the beginning, and it is true. Today's attack on the witnesses focuses on the alleged non-literalness of their experience. Dan Vogel is the principal advocate of this method of dismissing their testimony. For example, in his 2002 essay on the validity of the witnesses' testimonies, he attempts to devalue their statements by portraying them as alienated from empirical reality and as having merely imagined the plates of the Book of Mormon or seen them in a subjective hallucination. I've commented elsewhere on how bizarre it is to me that the witnesses, a group of early 19th century farmers who spent their lives rising at sunrise, pulling up stumps, clearing rocks, plowing fields, sowing seeds, seeds, carefully nurturing crops, raising livestock, milking cows, digging wells, building cabins, raising barns, harvesting their own food, bartering in an often cashless economy for what they could not produce themselves, wearing clothes made from plant fibers and skins, anxiously watching the seasons, and walking or riding animals out under the weather until they retired to their beds shortly after sunset in a world lit only by fire, are being portrayed as estranged from everyday empirical reality by people whose lives, like mine, consist to a large extent of staring at computer and television screens in artificially air-conditioned, artificially lit homes and offices clothed in synthetic fibers, commuting between the two in enclosed and air-conditioned mechanical vehicles while they listen to the radio, chat on their cell phones, and fiddle with their iPods, all of whose inner workings are largely mysterious to them, who buy their prepackaged food with little or no regard for the time or the season by means of plastic cards and electronic financial transfers from artificially illuminated and air-conditioned supermarkets enmeshed in international distribution networks of which they know virtually nothing, the rhythms of whose daily lives are largely unaffected by the rising and setting of the sun. Yet Vogel's view of the witnesses has recently been given wider currency in an article published by the non-Mormon biblical scholar Lester Grabb, who commendably seeks to show that Joseph Smith's story can illuminate ancient Hebrew prophecy. Unfortunately, Professor Grabb's discussion is wholly dependent upon Vogel, and wholly uninformed by any exposure to the work of the leading authority on the witnesses, Richard Lloyd Anderson. Grabb readily grants the sincerity of Martin Harris and David Whitmer, but also declares that it seems that no one saw the plates uncovered except Smith himself. Both Martin Harris and David Whitmer, of the three witnesses, he writes, while continuing to affirm their belief in the Book of Mormon, also stated that they had seen the plates in spirit or with spiritual eyes or in vision. Professor Grabb cites the Reverend John A. Clark's recollection of an unnamed attorney's alleged recollection of an alleged statement from Martin Harris. A gentleman in Palmyra, bred to the law, a professor of religion and of undoubted veracity, told me that on one occasion he appealed to Harris and asked him directly, "Did you see those plates?" Harris replied he did. "Did you see the plates and the engraving on them with your bodily eyes?" Harris replied, "Yes, I saw them with my eyes. They were shown unto me by the power of God and not of man. But did you see them with your natural, your bodily eyes, just as you see this pencil case in my hand? Now say no or yes to this." Harris replied, "Well, I did not see them as I do that pencil case, yet I saw them with the eye of faith. I saw them just as distinctly as I see anything around me, though at the time they were covered over with a cloth." Now that's the problematic last part. And yet Professor Grabb acknowledges the situation with the 8 witnesses is more complex, and some continue to assert that these members of the Whitmer family and others saw and handled the plates in a purely physical context. Some of the testimony certainly gives this impression, but we have a few later interviews with most of the 8 witnesses. There is some evidence that their experience was also spiritual or visionary or whatever one might want to call it. How did the witnesses come to see the plates? Thomas Ford, the former governor of Illinois, who, Grabb assures us, actually knew many Mormons, explains it all by means of an account of the experiences of the witnesses. Unfortunately, as Grabb concedes, he does not give his sources, and he has some of the names slightly wrong. Here it is. Joseph Smith set them to continual prayer and other spiritual exercises to acquire this lively faith by means of which the hidden things of God could be spiritually discerned. And at last, when he could delay them no longer, he assembled them in a room. Lucy Mack Smith says it was a grove near their house, and produced a box, which he said contained the precious treasure. The lid was opened. The witnesses peeped into it, but making no discovery, for the box was empty, they said, "Brother Joseph, we do not see the plates." The prophet answered them, "O ye of little faith, how long will God bear with this wicked and perverse generation? Down on your knees, brethren, every one of you, and pray God for the forgiveness of your sins, and for a holy and living faith which cometh down from heaven." The disciples dropped to their knees and began to pray in the fervency of their spirit, supplicating God for more than 2 hours with fanatical earnestness, at the end of which time, looking again into the box, they were now persuaded that they saw the plates. I leave it to philosophers to determine whether the fumes of an enthusiastic and fanatical imagination are thus capable of blinding the mind and deceiving the senses by so absurd a delusion. The details transmitted by Ford may be inaccurate, Dan Vogel comments, but the essence of the account contains an element of truth. An even more entertaining version of this theory appeared on an ex-Mormon message board just a few days ago. You see where I get my best data. Quote, I used to tease my kids. I would take my coat or a towel or a blanket and gather it up in the crook of my arm. Then I would stick my face down into it and make a whimpering sound like a puppy. Then I would make a petting motion. My little kids would see what was going on, and guess what? They wanted to see the puppy. Of course, I refused to let them see the puppy because there was not one. Then I would walk into another room. The kids would follow, demanding to see the puppy. I would run into another room. The kids would follow, but by then the puppy was gone. I would claim to have hidden the puppy. The kids would go crazy trying to find the puppy. It was great fun, but as my kids got a little older, they finally caught on. The trick no longer worked. When I tried it on their younger cousins, my kids would scoff and give the secret right off. Why was it a puppy? Because I said so, because I could make the sound of a puppy, because kids like puppies, and a puppy would fit under the cover. I never claimed to have a rabid grizzly bear or adult crocodile under the wrap for the inverse of all the reasons stated above. How convenient that the gold plates were gold instead of wood or zinc or stone. How convenient that they were a certain size and that they disappeared and that only Joe could read them. How convenient for the blood-sucking scum that currently runs the Mormon Corporation today that so many fanatical Mormon adults are dumb as preschoolers about certain things. It's high-quality analysis there. Professor Grab cites an account of an encounter between Theodore Turley and John Whitmer. Whitmer asked, "Do you hint at me?" Turley replied, "If the cap fits you, wear it. All I know is you've published to the world that an angel did present those plates to Joseph Smith." And Whitmer replied, "I now say I handled those plates. There was fine engravings on both sides. I handled them." And he described how they were hung, and they were shown to me by a supernatural power. By a supernatural power. He acknowledged all. Then Grab cites Vogel's introduction to that account, which declares that it seems to imply that while Whitmer's handling of the plates, perhaps in a box or through a covering, was physical, his seeing the plates was visionary. I am at a complete loss to understand how Whitmer's alleged statement that the plates were shown to him by a supernatural power, which incidentally is an anomalous outlier when compared to the numerous other accounts from John Whitmer, even if taken at face value, can be transformed so easily into the idea that his seeing of the plates was visionary. Grab also cites the notorious testimony of the disaffected 19th century Mormon Stephen Burnett, which makes an even bigger leap. I have reflected long and deliberately upon the history of this church and weighed the evidence for and against it, loath to give it up. But when I came to hear Martin Harris state in a public forum, I guess, that he never saw the plates with his natural eyes, only in vision or imagination, neither Oliver nor David, and also that the 8 witnesses never saw them and hesitated to sign that instrument for that reason, but were persuaded to do it, the last pedestal gave way. In my view, our foundations was sapped, and the entire superstructure fell a heap of ruins. In the end, Grab concludes, it appears that the only one who saw the plates directly was Joseph Smith himself, but even this situation could be doubted. Now, my wife fears that I have nothing original to say today, and she's probably right. Richard Anderson, the foremost authority on the subject and the author of, among other things, the classic Investigating the Book of Mormon Witnesses, has addressed this topic in an important recent article in the Farms Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, entitled straightforwardly enough, Attempts to Redefine the Experience of the 8 Witnesses. But frankly, originality doesn't matter to me on this topic. I want at the least to register a vigorous protest against what seems to me to have become baseless but unquestioned orthodoxy, in certain quarters at least, about the witnesses. They are often portrayed now by critics as gullible fools, unable to distinguish reality from fantasy, easily duped, and Martin Harris is their parade example. But this falsifies and misrepresents the facts. True to his reputation as a careful, prudent man, a businessman, and a farmer, Martin Harris initially approached the claims of Joseph Smith with hope, but also with cautious skepticism. It was Harris who took a transcript of characters from the plates to New York City for the evaluation of Professor Charles Anthon of Columbia University and others. And while he was serving as Joseph's first scribe for the translation, he once surreptitiously substituted a similar-looking stone for the seer stone that the prophet was using in order to see if it made any difference. It did. At one point, he lifted the box in which the plates were allegedly concealed to see what he could determine. You've heard this quote before. I knew from the heft, he recalled, that they were lead or gold, and I knew that Joseph had not credit enough to buy so much lead. So, obviously, he went for gold as the cheaper alternative, right? Martin Harris cross-examined Joseph, his wife, brothers, sisters, his father and mother. I talked with them separately that I might get the truth of the matter. One day, he arrived when Joseph was away from home. I was glad he was absent, Harris reminisced, for that gave me an opportunity of talking with his wife and the family about the plates. I talked with them separately to see if their stories agreed, and I found that they did agree. Did Martin Harris regard his experience as a witness as real? The 25-year-old Edward Moroni Thurman ran into Martin Harris at a blacksmith shop in Cache Valley and asked him whether the Book of Mormon was true. Harris responded by asking whether the young man could see an apple tree nearby. His vision of the angel, the plates, and the other objects, he told Thurman, had been as real and factual as the sight of the apple tree. When a group of teenagers posed the same question to him, he pointed to a chopping block and asked if they could see it. "Well, just as plain as you see that chopping block, I saw the plates, and sooner than I would deny it, I would lay my head upon that chopping block and let you chop it off." To William Pilkington he said, "Just as sure as you see the sun shining, just as sure am I that I stood in the presence of an angel of God with Joseph Smith and saw him hold the gold plates in his hands. I saw the Urim and Thummim, the breastplate, and the sword of Laban. I saw the angel descend from heaven. The heavens were then opened, and I heard the voice of God declare that everything the angel had told us was true, and that the Book of Mormon was translated correct. I was commanded by God's voice to testify to the whole world what I had seen and heard." Joseph Homer Snow recalled the time that Martin Harris came to have dinner with his family. Mother asked him these questions. "Did you actually see an angel and hear him speak?" He said, "Just as much so as I see you and hear you speak." "Will you describe how he stood?" Mother asked. He said, "He stood at least 20 inches off the ground, and he had records in his hand, the Book of Mormon. He turned the leaves and declared that it was the work of the Lord and that it was true. He commanded us to bear that testimony to the world." Stephen Burnett plainly misrepresented Martin Harris's testimony about his own experience. Harris would never have gone along with Burnett's only in vision, let alone with the notion that his experience was merely, quote, imaginary, end quote. So why should we trust Burnett's account of Harris's alleged account of the experience of the other witnesses? After all, Harris's supposed claim that the other witnesses were reluctant to endorse their published testimony is, on the basis of evidence that we've already alluded to, extremely suspect. In a notarized statement dated 29 October 1921, George Godfrey, who prepared Martin Harris's grave in Clarkston, Utah, summarized his lengthy acquaintance with the witness, and then he offered this interesting statement. "Prior to his death and in his last sickness, I sat up nights with him upon many an occasion. Many times I have heard the said Martin Harris bear witness to the truthfulness and genuineness of the Book of Mormon, at times when he was enjoying good health and spirits and when he was on his deathbed. His testimony never varied. I have seen others, and I myself have tried to entrap him relative to the testimony which he bore by cross-questioning him relative to the scenes and events which are church history in connection with the Book of Mormon. Upon all of these questions, his mind was clear as it was possible for the human mind to be, and his testimonies have left me no doubt in my mind that he actually did converse with an angel who bore testimony to him of the truthfulness of the records contained in the Book of Mormon, that he saw and handled the gold plates from which the said records were taken, that a few hours before his death, and when he was so weak and enfeebled that he was unable to recognize me or anyone, and knew not to whom he was speaking, I asked him if he did not feel that there was an element at least of fraudulence and deception in the things that were written and told of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And he replied as he had always done, many, many times in my hearing, with the same spirit that he always manifested when enjoying health and vigor. The Book of Mormon is no fake. I know what I know. I have seen what I have seen, and I have heard what I have heard. I have seen and handled the gold plates from which the Book of Mormon is written. An angel appeared to me and others and testified to the truthfulness of the record. And had I been willing to have perjured myself and sworn falsely to the testimony I now bear, I could have been a rich man. But I could not have testified other than I have done and am now doing, for these things are true." Martin Harris was buried with a copy of the Book of Mormon in his right hand and a copy of the Doctrine and Covenants in his left. In a patriarchal blessing given to him by Joseph Smith Sr., Harris was promised that, "Thy testimony shall yet convince its thousands and its tens of thousands. Yea, it shall shine like the sun. And though the wicked seek to overthrow it, it shall be in vain, for the Lord God shall bear it off victorious." In 1848, the year before he died, Oliver Cowdery received rebaptism into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at Canesville, Iowa. Before an audience of approximately 2,000, including non-members of the church, Cowdery bore witness. "I beheld with my eye and handled with my hands the gold plates from which it was translated. I also beheld the interpreters. That book is true." Cowdery was bedridden for most of 1849, probably as a result of chronic pulmonary tuberculosis, and died at Richmond, Missouri in March of 1850. A few months months before his death, Cowdery was visited by Jacob Gates, a Latter-day Saint traveling eastward on a mission to England, who had been a friend since before Cowdery's 1838 excommunication. In the course of conversation, Gates asked him about his experience as one of the witnesses to the Book of Mormon. Had it been a dream? Was it imagination or illusion or mere mythology? Cowdery rose from the place where he was resting, retrieved a first edition copy of the Book of Mormon, and read aloud the testimony of the three witnesses. Then turning to face Gates, he said, "Jacob, I want you to remember what I say to you. I am a dying man, and what would it profit me to tell you a lie? I know that this Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God. My eyes saw, my ears heard, and my understanding was touched, and I know that whereof I testified is true. It was no dream, no vain imagination of the mind. It was real." David Whitmer lived until 1888, the last of the witnesses to the Book of Mormon. Consequently, he was the most interviewed of all of them. Each witness of the Book of Mormon, Richard Anderson has observed, was an individualist, and David Whitmer, this quality verged on the stubborn. Whether in Mormon society or not, he stood like a rock for his principles. This outspoken and utterly honest personality would have been the first to detect fraud and expose it. Whitmer was excommunicated from the church on the 13th of April, 1838, after a period of doctrinal disagreement, financial stress, persecution, and upheaval. Yet when in 1886 the Omaha Herald asked him whether he, quote, still believed that Joseph Smith was a divinely inspired prophet, end quote, David Whitmer replied, "I know he was. It's not a matter of belief." The young James Henry Moyle, who just received his law degree from the University of Michigan and was returning home to Utah, took a detour to Richmond for the sole purpose of interviewing David Whitmer. When he saw the witness, he implored him to tell him the truth. He told Whitmer of the sacrifices that his family had made for the gospel's sake, driven from state to state, and finally pulling a handcart all the way to the arid desert of the Great Basin. I said to him, "I was born and reared in the church, and I do pray of you to let me know if there is any possibility of your having been deceived. I'm just commencing life as you're preparing to lay it down, and I beg of you to tell me if there's anything connected with the testimony which you have borne to the world that could possibly have been deceptive or misunderstood." I further said in an earnest youthful appeal that I didn't want to go through life believing in a falsehood, that it was in his power to make known the truth to me. His answer was unequivocal. There was no question about its truthfulness. The angel had stood in a little clear place in the woods with nothing between them but a fallen log. The angel on one side and the witnesses on the other. It had all occurred in broad, clear daylight. He saw the plates and heard the angel with unmistakable clearness. He was the first witness I ever attempted to cross-examine, Moyle wrote many years later, and I did so with all the intensity of my impelling desire to know the truth. The interview lasted 2.5 hours. The young lawyer, who subsequently served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in 2 federal administrations, came away utterly convinced of David Whitmer's sincerity. Throughout his life, Whitmer insisted that the experience was literal and physical, not merely imaginary or spiritual. Joseph Smith III, for example, recalled an 1884 exchange between the witness and a non-Mormon identified as Colonel Giles. Rather suggestively, he asked if it might not have been possible that he, Mr. Whitmer, had been mistaken and had simply been moved upon by some mental disturbance or hallucination which had deceived them into thinking he saw the personage, the angel, the plates, the Urim and Thummim, and the sword of Laban. How well and distinctly I remember the manner in which Elder Whitmer arose and drew himself up to his full height, a little over 6 feet, and said in solemn and impressive tones, "No, sir, I was not under any hallucination, nor was I deceived. I saw with these eyes and I heard with these ears. I know whereof I speak." In a letter to Anthony Metcalf in 1887, Whitmer again insisted on the literal reality of what he had seen. "Of course we were in the spirit when we had the view, for no man can behold the face of an angel except in a spiritual view. But we were in the body also, and everything was as natural to us as it is at any time." To Orson Pratt and Joseph F. Smith nearly a decade earlier, he had testified, "I saw the plates, the sword of Laban, the Urim and Thummim, and other artifacts, just as plain as I see this bed," striking his hand upon the bed beside him. "And I heard the voice of the Lord as distinctly as I ever heard anything in my life, declaring that the records of the plates of the Book of Mormon were translated by the gift and power of God. I saw them as plain as I see you now," he told a reporter from the Kansas City Journal in 1881. He frequently emphasized that the angel and the table on which the plates and other objects rested was very close to him and the other witnesses, within about 3 to 6 feet. Mr. Whitmer describes every detail of the vision with great precision, reported the Omaha Herald in 1886, and much fervency. Wilhelm Poulsen interviewed David Whitmer in 1878. When Poulsen asked him if the 8 witnesses did not handle the plates, Whitmer replied, "We did not, but they did." In January 1888, the Richmond Conservator reported on the last days of David Whitmer in memorable detail. On Sunday evening before his death, he called the family and his attending physician, Dr. George Buchanan, to his bedside and said, "Doctor, do you consider that I'm in my right mind?" To which the doctor replied, "Yes, you're in your right mind. I've just had a conversation with you." He then addressed himself to all present and said, "I want to give my dying testimony. You must be faithful in Christ. I want to say to you all that the Bible and the record of the Nephites are true, so you can say that you have heard me bear my testimony on my deathbed. All be faithful in Christ, and your reward will be according to your works. God bless you all. My trust is in Christ forever, worlds without end. Amen." I've been visited by thousands of people, David Whitmer told James Hart in 1883, believers and unbelievers, men and ladies of all degrees, sometimes as many as 15 in one day, and have never failed in my testimony, and they will know someday that my testimony is true. As Richard Anderson points out, 10 of the 42 surviving testimonies from the 8 witnesses mention handling the plates. Lucy Mack Smith, who knew the witnesses well and was there that day, says that they looked upon the plates and handled them. William Smith, son or brother to 3 of the 8, said that all of them testified that they not only saw with their eyes, but handled with their hands the said record. Perhaps already responding to suggestions that the experience of the 8 witnesses was merely spiritual and visionary, Hiram Smith insisted during an 1838 speech that it was entirely real. He said that he had but 2 hands and 2 eyes, Sally Parker remembered in a letter written in August of that year. He said he had seen the plates with his eyes and handled them with his hands. The year previously, Hiram married Mary Fielding. Shortly thereafter, her brother Joseph Fielding wrote, "My sister bears testimony that her husband has seen and handled the plates." And Hiram himself wrote in December 1839 of his sufferings in Missouri, where he'd been arrested in the fall of 1838 and then imprisoned in Liberty Jail from December to April. "I had been abused and thrust into a dungeon and confined for months on account of my faith and the testimony of Jesus Christ. However, I thank God that I felt a determination to die rather than deny the things which my eyes had seen, which my hands had handled, and which I had borne testimony to wherever my lot had been cast. I can assure my beloved brethren that I was able to bear as strong a testimony when nothing but death presented itself as ever I did in my life." Samuel Smith, Hiram's brother and another of the 8 witnesses, bore his testimony in the presence of 15-year-old Daniel Tyler, who summarized it as simply, "He knew his brother Joseph had the plates, for the prophet had shown them to him, and he had handled them and seen the engravings thereon." In an 1836 editorial in the church newspaper, John Whitmer bore strong testimony of his experience as one of the witnesses. "I desire to testify to all that will come to the knowledge of this address, that I have most assuredly seen the plates from whence the Book of Mormon is translated, that I have handled these plates, and know of a surety that Joseph Smith, Jr. has translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God. Therefore, know ye, O ye inhabitants of the earth, wherever this address may come, that I have in this thing freed my garments of your blood, whether you believe or disbelieve." But John Whitmer was excommunicated in March of 1838, 1 month before his brother David, and never returned to the church. For a brief period, it appears that John's spiritual confidence in the Book of Mormon was shaken by his separation from his former associates and by his bitterness over economic and other issues raised by the church's sojourn in Missouri. He was sorrowful and dejected about his excommunication, but also for at least a time quite angry at Joseph Smith and the church. Of all the witnesses, John Whitmer comes the closest, in a sense, to denying his testimony. During the 1839 exchange with Theodore Turley that we've already mentioned, Whitmer confessed to doubts about whether the Book of Mormon was true. Speaking of the original text on the plates, he said, "I cannot read it, and I do not know whether it's true or not." Nonetheless, he insisted, "I handled those plates. There were fine engravings on both sides. I handled them." This is highly impressive. Unlike the 3 witnesses who heard a divine voice testify to the truth of the translation of the plates, the 8 witnesses simply saw the plates under quite matter-of-fact conditions. Yet even in the depths of his alienation and bitterness, even when he was most inclined to doubt what he could not see for himself, even living as he did in the area of the worst anti-Mormon persecutions, John Whitmer could not deny that he had lifted and handled a metal object of substantial weight. Moreover, the bitterness, or at least the skepticism, was short-lived. After 1856, John Whitmer was the last survivor of the 8 witnesses. In 1861, Jacob Gates spoke with him for more than 4 hours. Gates then wrote of John Whitmer in his journal, "He still testified that the Book of Mormon is true and that Joseph Smith was a prophet of the Lord." Myron Bond reported in 1878 that old Father John Whitmer told me last winter with tears in his eyes that he knew as well as he knew he had an existence that Joseph translated the ancient writing which was upon the plates, which he saw and handled, and which, as one of the scribes, he helped to copy as the words fell from Joseph's lips. Wilhelm Paulsen interviewed him that same year. I said, "I'm aware that your name is affixed to the testimony in the Book of Mormon that you saw the plates." "It is so, and that testimony is true." "Did you handle the plates with your hands?" "I did so." "Then they were a material substance?" "Yes, as material as anything can be." "They were heavy to lift?" "Yes, and you know gold is a heavy metal. They were very heavy." "How big were the leaves?" "So far as I recollect, 8 by 6 or 7 inches." "Were the leaves thick?" "Yes, just so thick that characters could be engraven on both sides." "How were the leaves joined together?" "In 3 rings, each one in the shape of a D with a straight line towards the center." "Did you see them covered with a cloth?" "No." He handed them uncovered into our hands, and we turned the leaves sufficient to satisfy us. Finally, 6 months before his death, John Whitmer spoke at a public Sunday service. His remarks were reported in the Kingston Sentinel as follows: "Mr. Whitmer is considered a truthful, honest, and law-abiding citizen by this community, and consequently his appointment drew out a large audience. Mr. Whitmer stated that he had often handled the identical golden plates which Mr. Smith received from the hand of the angel." Were there real plates? Yes, there were. If anything in early Mormon history is well attested, surely the existence of the plates is. Let's consider the testimonies of several unofficial witnesses. The 16-year-old William Smith always remembered the night when his older brother Joseph outran pursuers. I have another slide here. Yes, there it is. When his older brother Joseph outran pursuers and brought the plates into the Smith home, William lifted the plates that night and estimated their weight at about 60 pounds. Joseph Smith's sister Catherine hefted the covered plates on several different occasions. She too recalled his arrival home with the plates and remembered that they were wrapped up in his frock. When he got to the door, he said, "Father, I've been followed. Look and see if you can see anyone." He then threw himself on the bed and fainted, and when he came to, he told us the circumstances. He had his thumb put out of place, and his arm was very lame. Her grandson remembered Catherine relating that when Joseph came in the house, he was completely out of breath. She took the plates from him and laid them on the table temporarily and helped revive him until he got breathing properly. Also treated his hand for the bruises on his knuckles. She said he entered the house running and threw himself on a couch, panting from his extraordinary exertion. Joseph allowed her to heft the package, but not to see the gold plates, as the angel had forbidden him to show them at that period. She said they were very heavy. Martin Harris says that he and his family lifted the plates in a box when they were first looking into Joseph's claims, and that he held the plates on his knee for a time while he and Joseph were preparing to hide them in the woods. He said that he had hefted the plates repeatedly. Harris put their weight at between 40 and 50, or another time between 40 and 60 pounds. Like his fellow witness David Whitmer, Harris gave the dimensions of the plates as 7 by 8 inches. William could feel the shape of the plates through the cloth that covered them. They were not quite as large as this Bible, he said. I could tell whether they were round or square. I could raise the leaves this way, raising a few leaves of the Bible before him. One could easily tell that they were not stone, hewn out to deceive, or even a block of wood. They were much heavier than stone, very much heavier than wood. I could tell, said William, that they were plates of some kind, that they were fastened together by rings running through the back. Now the rings, by the way, are a striking feature. We've already heard John Whitmer's testimony that there were 3 of them shaped like a capital D. Based on his interviews with 2 of the 3 witnesses, and especially with Hiram Smith, William McClellan also knew of connecting rings in the shape of the letter D, which he says facilitated the opening and shutting of the book, in the manner, I suppose, of modern 3-ring binders. David Whitmer also described the 3 D-shaped rings. It's difficult to imagine this degree of consensus regarding such an unusual detail if the plates were only imaginary or never uncovered. A brief article by Warren Aston, forthcoming in the Farms Insights newsletter, will examine the significance of these rings, and this is still under discussion, may point out a striking ancient parallel to them. Emma Smith, 2 months before her death, told her eldest son that the plates often lay on the table without any attempt at concealment, wrapped in a small linen tablecloth, which I'd given him to fold them in. I once felt of the plates as they thus lay on the table, tracing their outline and shape. They seemed to be pliable like thick paper, and would rustle with a metallic sound when the edges were moved by the thumb, as one sometimes thumbs the edges of a book. I moved them from place to place on the table as it was necessary on doing my housework. Herbert Salisbury, grandson of Joseph's sister Catherine, said that she told me that while dusting up the room where the prophet had his study, she saw a package on the table containing the gold plates on which was engraved the story of the Book of Mormon. She said she hefted those plates and found them very heavy like gold, also rippled her fingers up the edges of the plates and felt they were separate metal plates and heard the tinkle of sound that they made. In the face of such evidence, in order to protect his thesis, Dan Vogel must invent an ad hoc metallurgical fraud to supplement his insistence on complex collective hallucination. At the conclusion of his most sustained discussion of the witnesses, he suddenly suggests, without offering even a hint of supporting evidence for it, that Joseph Smith might perhaps conceivably have faked a set of tin plates in order to deceive his friends. This unevidenced and rather implausible pseudo-fact is, however, a topic for another occasion, when we'll also need to consider how the poor farm boy Joseph Smith also managed, it seems, to create a forged sword of Laban, a bogus Liahona, a fake breastplate, and a stage prop Urim and Thummim, and then somehow lost them without a trace. For one striking and often unnoticed aspect of the experience of the three witnesses is the fact that they saw more than the golden plates. The vision was considerably more complex than that, making deception via the fabrication of fake ancient artifacts an even more remote possibility. According to repeated testimony, besides the plates of the Book of Mormon and the angel, both the sealed and the unsealed portion, they saw the Urim and Thummim and the accompanying breastplate, the ball or director, the sword of Laban, the brass plates, and many other plates. The Urim and Thummim were two white stones, David Whitmer told Wilhelm Poulsen in 1878, each of them cased in as spectacles are in a kind of silver casing. But the bow between the stones was more heavy and longer apart between the stones than we usually find in spectacles. Lucy Mack Smith examined the Urim and Thummim and found that it consisted of two smooth three-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glasses were set in silver bows, which were connected with each other in much the same way as old-fashioned spectacles. As to the breastplate, Lucy recorded that, quote, "It was wrapped in a thin muslin handkerchief, so thin that I could see the glistening metal and ascertain its proportions without any difficulty. It was concave on one side and convex on the other, and extended from the neck downwards as far as the center of the stomach of a man of extraordinary size. It had 4 straps of the same material for the purpose of fastening it to the breast, 2 of which ran back to go over the shoulders, and the other 2 were designed to fasten to the hips. They were just the width of 2 of my fingers, for I measured them, and they had holes in the ends of them to be convenient in fastening." Even the receptacle in which the plates had lain hidden in the hill Cumorah has its witnesses. David Whitmer saw it. "It was a stone box," he told Wilhelm Poulsen in 1878, "and the stones looked to me as if they were cemented together. That was on the side of the hill, a little down from the top." According to a reporter for the Chicago Times who interviewed Whitmer in August 1875, 3 times has he been at the hill Cumorah and seen the casket that contained the tablets and the seer stone. Eventually, the casket had been washed down to the foot of the hill, but it was to be seen when he last visited that historic place. Both the Chicago Tribune in December 1885 and the Chicago Times in January 1888 reported his testimony that he and Oliver Cowdery had been guided to the hill Cumorah by Joseph Smith on one occasion, during which they had seen the receptacle together. Secular historians are more inclined than Mormons to suppress source material from Joseph's closest associates, remarks Richard Bushman, since, he says, quoting extensively from the reminiscences of those closest to the events, would tend to suffuse a modern narrative with their own faith and would turn readers' attention to Joseph's transparently sincere desire to obey God. Quote, "Believing historians are more inclined to be true to the basic sources than unbelieving ones." Those who wish to redefine the experiences of the witnesses clearly illustrate Professor Bushman's point. They quarrel with, disbelieve, and seek to explain away the principal sources for the very story they claim to illuminate. Without compelling evidentiary reason to do so, it's an exceedingly odd approach to history. Thank you.